Kia ora whanau, tēnā koto, tēnā koto, tēnā koto katua. That is a greeting from the indigenous people of New Zealand, the Maori people, and I greet you today. It's a real privilege for me to be here tonight with you all, old friends, mentors, leaders, partners in ministry. I'm a Kenyan missionary in New Zealand, and I've been there for the last 10 years. So the 10 years that Dennis has been here, I've been in New Zealand, and it's a privilege for me to be on this occasion. Dennis and Irene, thank you for your partnership, for your friendship, for your support, for everything that you've done. We've journeyed together since the Church Army days, and I feel real privileged to be here with you today. So, I want to congratulate CMS-Africa on your 10th anniversary. And just give thanks to God for what you have achieved for these 10 years. I've watched your journey, even from New Zealand, and it's been a privilege to see how God has used you to be able to impact so many communities around this continent. I look forward to working with you, Canon Moses, on this new journey for the next wee while, as we seek together to see the gospel move forward in this continent and beyond. I love your tagline, CMS Africa Mission from Africa to the World. And that's what you've asked me to talk about tonight, the role of CMS Africa in seeking to reach out in global Christian mission. Now, how many of you have watched the movie Black Panther? Yep, you've seen the movie? Yeah. Do you like it? I think many Africans and non-Africans have for years been yearning for something that flips the script on the stories that Hollywood has put out and has told about the African people and Africa. We've had so many stories about war and corruption and poverty and disease that have for too long been the main portrayal of Africans on the big screen. Now, granted, many of these stories are true, or they are an adaptation of some of what happens here. And sometimes we as a church have been caught up with that narrative, the negative thinking, the poverty mindset. You know, we like to tell some of the stories, negative stories abroad about Africa itself. Because you see, much of the global perception of Africa and Africa's needs is shaped by the media, whose focus is actually quite negative. But to dwell on Africa's problems and shortcomings is to take a one-sided approach and to neglect the beauty, the diversity, the positivity pocketed in every part of this continent. And you know it, for those of you who are here from different parts of the continent. To focus on the negative is to miss out the true nature and face and the essential distinctive characteristics of the African people. The way we define ourselves, the warmth and the dignity of African people, our incomparable spiritual sense, the value of family, the respect for the elders, the celebration of diversity, the hospitality of our people, and in the inexplicable joy and vibrancy, even in the midst of suffering and difficulty and persecution. And yet the TV doesn't record this. I think the gap that the Blank Father is trying to fill is this. You walk away from the movie with a heart of pride about Africa. In my little time that I've been back here in Kenya for the last 2.5 weeks, I've noticed how the Wakanda theme is rampant across in the schools, in the churches. People are talking about the Wakanda people. It's finally Africa's time to shine. And it's not just about what this movie talks about that makes Africa positive. 5 years ago, the Harvard Business Review published an article written by Jonathan Berman, who suggested 7 reasons why it's Africa's time, that Africa's time was now. And the 7 included the huge market opportunity. The African middle class is bigger than India. The size of Africa and the resources it has great interest globally. Africa's economy is growing faster than any other continent in the world, with a GDP of 6% and above. And that's why perhaps so many global corporations are investing in Africa. The mobile is exploding, 85% penetration. Most of the world's uncultivated arable land is in Africa. And that's why I believe that you, CMS Africa, have bumped on something that is actually amazing. Because the Samaritan strategy seeks to do exactly that. Your training is about helping Africans not just look at themselves in terms of that poverty mindset, but in terms of the gifts and the blessings that God has given us. And for me, as I think about the alignment between what the world is telling us and what the Bible tells us and what we are seeing, is this gift that God has given Africa. And it's a gift of the social capital that we have. It's one of Jonathan Berman's 7 reasons he mentions why Africa is a continent to watch. Because we will soon have the world's largest workforce, swelling by 183 million in this decade and surpassing China's workforce by 2035. By 2050, Africa will account for 25% of the world's workforce. By working force, we're talking about those aged between 15 and 64. Why is that the case? Just by sheer numbers of population growth. I was looking at the World Population Census Prospectus 2015 that suggested that at 7 billion right now, we expect over the next 80 years the world population to grow to 11 billion. Okay? Africa now is about 1.1 billion, or around that figure. In the next 80 years, Africa will grow to 4.3 billion, which means over the next 80 years, out of 100% of the growth that we will experience, 75% of the growth will come from Africa. So 3 billion out of the 4 billion growth in the population of the world is Africa. That is massive, brothers and sisters. Secondly, is the age of the population. The median age in Africa in 2017 was 19.4 years. In OECD, Western countries, Europe, and other places, it's 40 years. We are half in terms of the median age. We are half of the world's median age. That says a lot. We're young. And then thirdly is in investment in education. Africa invests 20% of its spending in education, while OECD countries, New Zealand, Australia, is about 11%. We are the continent to watch. But there's more. The church in Africa is growing faster than any other continent. It's predicted that 40% of the world's Christians will reside in sub-Saharan Africa by the year 2020. Now we know there are more Anglicans in Africa than the rest of the world put together. Now what does that mean for global missions? What does that mean for CMS-Africa? What does that mean for the CMS network? Well, Jesus reminds us in Matthew 9, 35 to 37. That he went through all the towns and villages, teaching in the synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, and healing every disease and sickness. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. And he said to his disciples, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into the harvest field. You tell me where the workers for mission will come from if I've just told you where the workforce, the global workforce will come from. Where will the workers come from? So if you are praying for God to reach out to the nations, then you better be an answer to that prayer. So Africa will not only be the world's leading sending continent in the world, but it will become the training ground for missions. This is where people will be coming to observe new models of ministry and engagement, of discipleship, of leadership training, of community transformation. This is where they'll be coming to watch. And that's why I love your tagline when in your transformational programs, come and see. Because you're inviting people to come and see how communities are being transformed so they can be inspired to take those ideas back into their own communities. In my little part of the world, New Zealand is hardly 5 million people, where God has called me. We have begun at CMS New Zealand to take seriously this whole idea of reverse missions. Since 2014, we've seen 80 Africans come to New Zealand as evangelists. They've been received, and since then, about a dozen of them have come back. They are being well received as youth pastors, vicars, community workers, skilled migrants in the marketplace, evangelists, children workers, sports people. New Zealand is desperate for workers. Desperate for workers. Can't we help? The harvest is plentiful, the workers are few. He saw the crowds and he saw that they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. You see, this concept of African leaders leading and serving global is not new. The General Secretary of the Anglican Communion is African, Nigerian. The International President of the Navigators is Kenyan. The International Director of SIM is Nigerian. It's Africa's moment. What is it that we actually offer as Africans? And then make a comment of what it will require to activate this sleeping giant that is Africa. The gifts we offer. We offer a vibrant faith. We know what it means to trust God when you have minimal resources, to wake up in the morning, you have no job, you have no idea where the money will come from, you've got children to feed, and you trust God to provide for you. We have vibrant faith. We don't depend on financial resources to do things. We speak faith. We speak things that are not as though they are. That's who we are. We have this can-do mentality. The world needs that. We have confidence in the power of the gospel to change lives. We know that the gospel transforms people. The world needs that. We have a simple lifestyle. Many of you, we've just had comments about the stories of the foot soldiers of CMS-Africa and the lifestyle. You live simply. See, many of the missionaries in Africa can live anywhere, eat anything, sleep anywhere, and still have joy. That's who we are. This is a mission for us for the future, brothers and sisters. We have the gift of community in a world of individualism where mental health is becoming an epidemic. In New Zealand, we are seeing suicides. In 1 week in the city I live in, Christchurch, with 400,000 people, 1 week we had 8 young people take away their lives. It's an epidemic of mental health, but we have community here. It's a gift to be able to be relational, to be able to talk on the phone. I find that in New Zealand, I can go for a month without anybody calling me because there's nothing to talk about. People call you if they ask you a question. Most calls last 30 seconds. If I call someone just want to have a chat, they'll ask me, how can I help you? Well, I don't need help. I just want to talk. In Kenya, I've been here for 2.5 weeks and have 1 hour-long conversations, 2 hour-long conversations with Kenyans because Kenyans, Africans, we just love to talk. But that's therapy. That's therapy. Community. It's a gift we offer the world. Innovation, not just M-Pesa, but other creative ways in which we Africans are able to provide service to people. Contextual theology. Theology of suffering and conflict, holistic understanding. Living in a context of suffering and conflict, we have learned what it means to forgive, to have contentment when things are not okay, to live with the intention of the already of the kingdom and the not yet of the kingdom. Somehow, things don't have to be straight and smooth. We have learned what it means to live in conflict, to live with people we disagree with, and somehow get along with life. It's not the end of the world. Multicultural competence. Many of us speak 2 or 3 languages. It's a gift. The fact that we coexist with so many different tribes and communities. It's a gift, that cultural capability. And then the youth and energy that we have. Sometimes we don't realize the blessings that God has given us until we go away somewhere else and discover what others don't have. You're blessed, brothers and sisters. So we have lots to offer. But if Africa is to take its place in global mission, what will it require? 3 quick things, and I'll finish. 1, we will need depth. You see, the question is not how many Christians we have in Africa. It's not how wide the church is growing. It's not the numbers, not how big buildings we are building. It's not about structures. It is what kind of Christians are we producing in Africa? That is the question. And the church in Africa needs to be striving to ensure that we are mission-minded Christians whose faith is both scripturally solid and culturally relevant. And the Great Commission applies to us as well. We were given the Great Commission to go into all the nations. Africa is known to be orthodox theologically, and we have a role to be able to critique the revisionist theology that we find even in the West. We can help. So how can we deepen our faith? Through discipleship. We had Henry talk about that. Through a leadership that calls faith communities back to a purer and more authentic faith in places where we have compromised. My brother-in-law, Ruben Kigame, has just produced a book called Christian Apologetics Through African Eyes. He spent 20 years of his life trying to look at Africa and ways in which we compromise the gospel. The difference between orthodoxy and cults sometimes can be a bit mixed in Africa. And sometimes we don't know how to critique what we hear the preachers talk about, and it's not quite straight. It's not from the Bible. We don't know how to do that. We've respected our leaders and said, you shall not touch the Lord's anointed. We cannot question the elders. We cannot question our leaders. But by doing that, we are not growing in depth. We cannot afford not to hold those in authority to account for what they teach. We must grow in depth. I've heard recently, just in the last 2 weeks I've been here, that there are 2 ways of getting rich quickly in Africa. You've heard them? 1, you become a politician, or you start a church. Those are the 2 ways of getting quick rich in Africa. It's actually quite sad. It's quite tragic. But it means that we must fight and not allow the values that make us African Christians to be eroded by structural evil. We must not be silent. We must grow a spine and have holy anger. Helpless without a shepherd, the people that Jesus sees. So we also need a depth of understanding that helps us value what God has given us and be generous to share it with others within Africa and beyond. As God told Jonah about Nineveh, should I not be concerned about this great city of Nineveh, in which there are 120,000 people who cannot tell their right hand from the left? And I even like for the environmentalists and also animals. Should I not be concerned? Should we just be concerned about bigger buildings, better buildings, good-looking buildings, when there are so many people in some of the places in the world where 3 or 4 generations of unchurched people who have no idea about the gospel? In some places in New Zealand, if you ask a child at the age of 7 what Christmas is, they have no idea that it has any connection with Christianity. That is how far we have gone. Should we not be concerned? Depth. Secondly, models. We need models that are imaginative, unique, and fit for purpose. I love the story in 1 Kings 17, 38 and 40, where David is being called out to go and fight Goliath, and so thinks that he can prepare David for the battle. And so he dresses David with his own tunic. He puts his coat of armor around him and a bronze helmet on his head. David fastened the sword over the tunic, tried walking around in Saul's armor, and he couldn't because he wasn't used to it. And he said, I cannot go in this. He said to Saul, because I'm not used to them. And he took them off. We as Africans cannot copy the models that have worked for missions in the West. We are Africans. We've got to be innovative and creative. We've got to figure out what works for us in our context. We have to take off Saul's armor. David took the staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones from the stream, put on in his pouch, in his shepherd's bag, and with his sling in his hand, approached the Philistines. The giants that we will fight, we will have to use what God has given us. What is it that we have in our hand? We don't need to be apologetic about it. We need to be creative. Africa has an overcapacity of trained personnel workers, and yet we lack a pathway to release this massive workforce to the ends of the earth. Why? Because we haven't figured out how. Maybe our models are not fit for purpose. It's Africa's time. We need creativity and new strategies and a vision. I saw in May this year, in one of the Nairobi newspapers, there was an article entitled How 600 Nurses Are Migrating Abroad from Kenya. Most of these have undergone specialized training in renal and ICU care, and they mostly migrate to Canada, Australia, and the US. So, we are releasing 600 nurses just from Kenya alone. I mean, think of other countries, in Africa. Africans are going to go anyway as professionals. So why not train and equip these people who are going to go anyway as missionaries? When was the last time in your church you commissioned business people and other professionals as missionaries as they went out to do real jobs? The role of the African church is not just sending missionaries, but creating hubs of training here in Africa so that we can train people around the world. We have a lot to offer. But unfortunately, a lot of our models are more we want to receive rather than give. So we need to be generous with what God has given us. One of the few things that I've been doing over the last few years is actually identifying key emerging leaders from New Zealand and bringing them to Africa to train them here. Because I can tell you honestly, I cannot find many places in New Zealand where I can train missional leaders. I'm having to train them here. This is a place, this is a training ground for the next generation of church planters, of mission-minded people in New Zealand. We need to think that way. So we need depth. We need models that are creative and innovative. And then finally, we need strategic partnerships. We need one another. It's been mentioned here before. One of the baggages we carry from the colonial era is the spirit of competition and independence. Partition of African men that we work independently and as nation states, and somehow the connectivity between us as Africa is not great. Genesis 1:6 has this image, this picture, where God says, the people who are building the tower, if there's one people speaking the same language, they have begun to do this, then nothing they seek to do will be impossible for them. It's a picture of the power of unity. What if we gather together? What if instead of, as we normally do, copying each other's ideas so that it's my organization that gets the glory, we learn to cooperate a little bit more. We learn to share a little bit more. What if you decide that you will give 10% of your time to blessing someone else in another ministry that has no direct benefit to you? What if you did that? What if we were more intentional about figuring out what God is doing across the ditch or across the town or somewhere else or in Uganda? What if we did that? Cultivating a spirit of generosity, giving our best. And so, in summary, Africa has much to offer in global missions. We have the people that God has given us, the social capital. But we need depth, we need creative models, and we need strategic partnerships with one another within Africa, but also with other mission organizations, both emerging and traditional mission groups and churches around the world. So I'll finish with a picture. I live in New Zealand, and you know New Zealand is the land of the yes, Kiwi, sheep, more sheep than people, but the Hobbit, the All Blacks. Now, you know we are football people in Kenya. We're not really rugby people, are we? So I didn't know much about rugby. I mean, I watch. Wow, look at that. I have been away for too long. Fantastic. Oh, I love it. I love to hear that. Because I wasn't like that. I wasn't a rugby person. But in New Zealand, I got caught up with rugby. And now I love rugby, watching rugby so much that actually when my favorite team is watching, I have butterflies in my stomach. I just can't enjoy the game. You know the feeling when, when you're watching the game and it's going the wrong way and you're not sure how it's going to go. And it's just an uncomfortable feeling, some of those World Cups and you're not sure where it's going to go. So I've come up with a sneaky way of, not always, but sometimes knowing how to watch the game and enjoy it. I record the game and I check the score. And when I know that my team has won, I know you're laughing at me. When I know that my team has won, I can sit down, I can put my legs up, I can have my cup of coffee, and I can watch the game and enjoy it. Because I know the final score. Revelation 7:9 tells us the final score. And the final score is that I looked, and there before me was a great multitude that no one could count, from every tribe, nation, people, language, gathered before the throne of God and before the Lamb. What a compelling vision of reality. This is what's going to happen. We know how the story ends. We don't have to, it's not that trying to figure out whether we're on the winning side or not. We know how the story ends. See, I want to spend my life, brothers and sisters, I want to spend the remaining part of my life trying to figure out what it means for the African church to take its place in seeing the nations around the world follow Jesus. That's my life calling, because I believe it's Africa's moment. Will you join me? What part will you play? Will you commit yourself? Will you release your sons and daughters and grandchildren to this task of seeing the nations know and worship Jesus? Will you do that? Let me pray. May God bless us with less stress, discomfort about easy answers, half-truths, superficial relationships, so that we may seek truth boldly and love deep within our hearts. May God bless us with holy anger at injustice, oppression, exploitation of people, so that we may tirelessly work for justice, freedom, and peace among all people. May God bless us with the gift of tears to shed for those who suffer from pain, rejection, starvation, or the loss of all that they cherish, so that we may reach out our hands and comfort them and transform their pain into joy.